They said, "It's just for a minute, Grandma. The guests don't want to see you like this." Then they locked the door. Those words echo in my mind like a cruel joke I never quite woke up from. I was 81 then, already carrying the weight of a long life in my bones and wrinkles. But I had never imagined being treated like a secret or an inconvenience, especially not by my own family. I'm Martha, and I live alone now in a small, modest flat by the river, where the sunlight slips softly through the windows in the afternoons, and the air carries the scent of rain on old stone. It's quiet there, quieter than most homes I've lived in, but it's mine, and nobody locks the door on me anymore. That night, in my daughter's new house, shiny and cold, all glass and polished surfaces with too much laughter and too many perfect smiles, I was invited, but not really included. They smiled, nodded, said the right words, but I could feel the distance growing with every forced laugh, every polite but sharp glance away from me. I wore a dress I hadn't chosen, a color I didn't love, and a smile that was brittle, like glass too thin for the weight of what was coming. It was a housewarming party, they said, a celebration of new beginnings. But as the night unfolded, I realized I was the one they wanted to erase. I started telling a story from my youth, a little joke about a summer long ago, when the world seemed kinder and my laughter was loud and free. But my granddaughter's face tightened, her eyes darting anxiously toward her mother. My daughter interrupted with a sharpness that surprised me, saying I'd had too much wine when I hadn't even touched a drop. The room shifted in an instant, the warmth fading like the last embers of a fire. They smiled again, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that builds walls. Then came the excuse. They needed me to take a break, to cool down, to be somewhere private until the guests stopped noticing. I was led downstairs, down a narrow hallway where the walls were too white and too clean, where the light was harsh and unforgiving, into a small bathroom that smelled faintly of expensive soap and loneliness. They told me it was just for a minute, but as the door clicked shut behind me and the lock slid into place, the weight of the silence pressed down like a stone on my chest. In that moment, the truth settled like cold rain. I was being hidden away, locked in, not because I was unwell or confused, but because I was inconvenient. A reminder of a past they wanted to forget. Outside, the muffled sounds of laughter, music, and clinking glasses drifted through the walls, a cruel symphony that mocked my sudden invisibility. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, the cold porcelain biting into my skin, and I counted the phones scattered carelessly on the shelves and counters. 3 of them buzzing softly with the lives I was suddenly excluded from. The first belonged to my daughter, its screen lighting up with messages from friends gossiping about the party, their words sharp and unkind about Grandma's embarrassing moment. The second was my son-in-law's, filled with emails and calls I wasn't meant to answer, conversations about business and plans that didn't include me. The third was my granddaughter's, the youngest of them all, scrolling through social media with the ease of someone who has never had to worry about being erased. I looked at those phones, objects I had never cared for but suddenly saw as symbols of my own erasure. And in the quiet rage that welled inside me, I understood something profound. I was not powerless. The cold light in that bathroom no longer felt like a prison, but a stage. They wanted me invisible, forgotten, silent. I decided then I would make them remember. Outside the locked door, they continued their celebration, unaware that I was quietly gathering the strength I had thought lost with time. I thought about all the times I had been pushed aside, ignored, or told to be quiet for the sake of appearances. I thought about the years spent cooking meals, knitting sweaters, and stitching together family memories that seemed to unravel as easily as loose thread. I thought about the life I had led, full of love and sacrifices no one ever thanked me for. But that night, locked away from their perfect party, I found a clarity I hadn't known I still possessed. I was still here, still alive, still worthy of being seen and heard. When the door finally opened and they looked at me with surprise and a flicker of guilt, I was no longer the timid grandmother who would quietly apologize and retreat. I was a woman who had reclaimed her presence, even if it meant flushing away their phones one by one, turning their symbols of exclusion into the sound of their own neglect swirling down the drain. That moment, harsh and humiliating as it was, became a turning point. I left that house with more than just my coat and purse. I left with the unshakable knowledge that I would never again be locked away, silenced or dismissed. The small flat by the river, with its soft light and gentle rain, became my refuge and my rebirth. And every day since, I remind myself and others like me that we are not shadows to be hidden, but women who carry stories worth telling and voices that deserve to be heard. So if you find yourself locked away, forgotten in the noise of others' lives, remember this: you are not alone, and your time to step back into the light is now. They said it was just a moment, a small pause in the celebration, a chance for me to rest away from the crowd that didn't seem to want me there anyway. I had thought it was just a polite gesture, a temporary refuge from the noise and the uneasy glances that followed me like shadows wherever I went. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and the laughter on the other side of the door became distant and muffled, I began to understand that I was no longer part of the party. The lock clicked sharply again, a final seal on the invisible wall that separated me from the family I once believed would protect me. I sat on the cold tile floor, the porcelain of the toilet bowl cool beneath my hands as I leaned forward. Not out of weakness, but because the weight of betrayal pressed down with a clarity I had never known before. This was not an accident nor a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of exclusion, a quiet violence cloaked in civility. I remembered every step leading to this moment. The smiles that never quite reached their eyes, the hurried conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the way my stories were interrupted or ignored, as if my presence was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I was no longer a mother, a grandmother, or a woman who had spent decades building a family. I was a burden to be hidden away until the party was over. Outside that bathroom door, the world continued without me. I could hear the clinking of glasses, the burst of laughter from a joke I would never hear, the soft music that filled the rooms where I had once imagined belonging. The cruelest sound was the occasional ding of a phone, a reminder that their lives went on, connected and whole, while I was locked away in silence. It was then I noticed the phones themselves, 3 small devices carelessly left behind on the bathroom counter and cabinet shelves, their screens alive with messages and calls that I could neither answer nor ignore. One belonged to my daughter, the very woman who had promised me a place at the table. Her phone was flooded with texts from friends discussing the party, their words laced with thinly veiled judgment and whispered gossip about Grandma's moment. The second phone was my son-in-law's, filled with work emails and reminders of meetings that I was no longer part of, a life that marched forward without space for me. The third was my granddaughter's, the youngest, scrolling through social media with a casualness born of youth and freedom, unaware of how quickly her grandmother was being erased from the story. I reached for the first phone, holding it gently in my hands, as if it were a fragile piece of glass. The screen lit up with a conversation I wasn't meant to see. Words like embarrassing, too much, and not the image we want. A pang of sorrow struck me, but beneath it, a growing sense of quiet rebellion. This was not the end of my story. This was a turning point. I could either disappear like they wanted, or I could make them see me in a way they would never forget. The idea came slowly at first, a flicker of fire in the hollow space where hurt had settled. I pressed the phone gently into the water in the sink, hearing the faint crackle as the screen gave way, the bubbles rising as their world began to drown. One by one, I repeated the act with the other phones. There was no satisfaction in destruction, no joy in vengeance, only a solemn reclaiming of my dignity and my space. This was a quiet declaration. I was still here, and I would no longer be silenced or sidelined. When the door finally opened hours later, and they saw me sitting calmly on the edge of the bathtub, their faces a mix of shock, confusion, and anger, I met their eyes steadily. I did not yell or cry. I simply stood, gathered my coat and purse, and walked away from the house that had once promised warmth, but delivered cold exclusion. The betrayal cut deep, but in that wound, a new strength took root. I learned that sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the greatest cruelty, not because they hate us, but because they are afraid of who we truly are and what we might become if we refuse to be hidden. Since that night, I have carried the memory of locked doors and flushed phones as both a scar and a badge of honor. They remind me that I survived, not despite the betrayal, but because of it. And now, in the quiet of my own home, I tell my story to anyone who will listen, so they may find the courage to unlock their own doors and claim their place in the world once more. The moment the bathroom door closed behind me and the lock clicked into place, a strange clarity settled over me, sharper and colder than any shock or hurt I had felt before. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, feeling the cool porcelain beneath my fingertips, and listened to the muffled sounds of celebration fading away on the other side of the door. The truth I had suspected all along now settled like a stone in my chest. I was no longer part of the family gathering, no longer a welcomed guest in the house that was supposed to be my daughter's new home. The initial confusion gave way to a quiet resolve, a slow-burning flame ignited by the realization that I could either remain trapped in this moment of invisibility or reclaim my story with deliberate steps of my own. The 3 phones left behind in the bathroom, one belonging to my daughter, another to my son-in-law, and the last to my granddaughter, reminded me painfully of the connections I had lost, yet also of the power I still held, hidden beneath the surface, of their neglect. After the first phone was silenced forever in the bowl, I took a deep breath and allowed myself to imagine a new path. When the door finally opened hours later and I was released back into the night, I did not return to the party, nor to the warm but hollow smiles of the guests. Instead, I walked out into the cool air of the evening, the city lights soft around me like a promise of something different. I had no clear plan, only the quiet certainty that I needed to find a place where I could be seen and heard, where my presence would not be an afterthought or an embarrassment. I took the small purse my daughter had handed me in passing, filled with a few essentials but no room for memories or apologies, and I set off with nothing but my own feet and a heart stubborn enough to beat against the tide of rejection. I found a bench near a quiet park and sat with my coat pulled tight around me, watching the distant hum of life moving forward without me. The stars overhead were cold and distant, but beneath them, I felt a stirring of hope, fragile yet real. The next day, I made the decision that would change everything. I bought a one-way ticket to a city I had once known, far from the polished surfaces and curated lives that had cast me aside. I paid for it with my own money, from an account my son did not know existed, the savings of a lifetime quietly tucked away for moments just like this. Portland was the place I chose, not because I expected to find paradise, but because it was a place where I could begin again without the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. Upon arrival, the city welcomed me with its damp air and sharp scent of rain on pine, the streets familiar yet new through the eyes of someone who had learned long ago how to walk alone. I rented a small room in a modest motel, the kind of place where the floors creaked and the scent of cleaning fluid mingled with stories of lives lived and left behind. There, in the quiet solitude of that humble space, I allowed myself to breathe freely for the first time in months, letting the memories of locked doors and flushed phones fade into the background like distant thunder. It was not an escape, but a reckoning, a conscious step away from the roles and expectations that had defined me for so long. In the days that followed, I sought out a rhythm of my own making. I found work at a small cafe, a place where the smell of burnt toast and fresh coffee filled the air, and where my hands learned again the simple art of carrying plates and pouring cups without trembling. My co-workers did not ask about my past or my family. They accepted me as I was, a woman who showed up and did her job with quiet dignity. Each paycheck was a small victory, a tangible proof that I was no longer dependent on those who had chosen to erase me. I bought myself a coat, navy and warm, a symbol of respect for the woman I was becoming rather than the grandmother they wanted to hide. The coat fit like a promise, a tangible reminder that I was worthy of care and attention on my own terms. Slowly, I built a life not out of grand gestures or dramatic breaks, but from the quiet moments of choosing myself again. A walk to the bakery, a smile shared with a stranger, a crossword puzzle completed in the soft light of evening. Letters arrived from my grandson, the only family member who still reached out without judgment or expectation. His words were a lifeline, delicate and sincere, bridging the distance I had placed between myself and the past. Yet I did not rush to respond. I was learning that healing required time, that sometimes the most radical act was simply to wait and to hold space for oneself. When my daughter visited the cafe months later, her presence was awkward, a mix of apology and entitlement that neither of us could fully express. I listened as she spoke of panic and regret, of the fractured family left behind. But I knew that my choice was not about punishment, but about survival. I was no longer the shadow she had tried to cast me as. I was a woman who had reclaimed her voice, her space, and her story. I refused to be drawn back into the cycle of control and dismissal. Instead, I embraced the life I had begun in the quiet corners of Portland, surrounded by new friendships and small acts of kindness that felt like home. The days grew shorter, the rain more frequent. But with each passing moment, I felt the weight of the past lift just a little more. I was no longer waiting for permission or validation. I was simply living. And in that living, I found freedom. The moment I stepped into the room Joyce offered me, a small and modest space tucked away on the upper floor of her weathered blue house, sunlight spilled through the window and wrapped around me like a tentative welcome, the kind you feel before you fully believe it. It wasn't much, just a twin bed, a dresser that had seen better days, and a small desk where the paint was chipped and the chair wobbled slightly. But it was mine. For the first time in what felt like years, I had a room that wasn't borrowed or imposed, a space where I could fold myself quietly into the edges without apology. Joyce was a woman of few words but strong presence, her sharp eyes softened by years of solitude and perhaps a touch of understanding. She didn't ask why I'd come or where I'd been. Instead, she handed me a key with a cigarette in one hand and a cat curled at her feet, as if saying, "This is your refuge. Make of it what you will." Those early days were slow and deliberate. I woke to the gentle creaks and groans of an old house that had lived many lives before mine and would live many more after. The morning smelled of coffee and something earthy, the kind of warmth that comes from routine and quiet company. I found myself helping Joyce in small ways, pulling weeds in her garden or keeping the kitchen tidy, tasks that felt grounding and offered a rhythm I hadn't realized I missed. When I found work at the cafe, it wasn't just a job but a reclamation of purpose. The smell of coffee grounds and burnt toast, the clatter of dishes, the early morning light filtering through windows that were scratched and fogged. These became the backdrop of my new life. My hands, once trembling with uncertainty, steadied as I learned to pour, to carry, to smile without pretense. My co-workers were a patchwork of stories and struggles, none of which I needed to explain or defend. They saw me as I was, a woman who showed up, who worked, who belonged. The first paycheck felt like a secret triumph, folded neatly into my purse and carried with a pride I hadn't allowed myself in decades. I spent a quiet afternoon wandering through a secondhand clothing shop, the bell tinkling softly as I stepped inside, greeted by a young woman with a genuine smile. I told her I was looking for something that made me feel like myself again, not expecting much, but hoping for a small piece of dignity sewn into fabric. The navy wool coat I chose wasn't new or flashy, but it fit like a promise, warm and solid and waiting. When I wore it home that evening, it was more than clothing. It was a shield, a declaration that I was still here, still capable of choosing who I wanted to be. As the weeks passed, I found a rhythm that felt like freedom. I walked the neighborhoods, learned the names of the streets and the smells of the bakeries, the quiet places where the world moved without the weight of expectation. Letters came from my grandson, the only thread left from the family I'd left behind. Each word a small balm to the ache of absence and loss. Yet I held back from replying, knowing that healing was a journey I had to walk alone for now. When my daughter came to the cafe months later, her presence was fragile and unsure. She spoke of regret and panic, of a family unraveling, but I stood firm, no longer the shadow she tried to cast me as. I was a woman who had reclaimed her voice and her space. I would not return to the old roles or the silent sacrifices. Instead, I embraced the quiet power of new connections. Joyce's steady companionship, the gentle kindness of strangers who became friends, and the deepening bond with my grandson that, while distant, was real and unpressured. The coat hung by my door, a daily reminder that this life, imperfect and unhurried, was mine to live. In the quiet mornings and soft evenings, I learned that freedom was not found in grand escapes or loud declarations, but in the steady reclaiming of self, step by deliberate step. The past, with all its shadows and scars, no longer held the power to define me. I was building something new, not just a life, but a home within myself, a place where I was seen, respected, and whole. The days began quietly, with a rhythm that soothed the sharp edges of the betrayal I had endured. The small rituals I created in my new life, waking early, brewing coffee, walking to the cafe, became anchors that kept me steady as the past lurked at the edges of my consciousness, sometimes gentle, sometimes insistent. Then came the letter, slipped under the door one rainy afternoon by Joyce, its envelope thick and unfamiliar. The handwriting was a careful script, the kind learned in school and practiced over years of letters exchanged in times when phones were less common and words were chosen with care. It was from Kieran, my grandson, the only one who had reached out without judgment or expectation, the one who still remembered the afternoons we spent building birdhouses and painting them bright red, imagining they would be the coolest place in the yard. His words were filled with worry and hope. A bridge stretched across the distance that now separated us. He wrote that his parents were frantic, that they feared for me, that they didn't understand why I had disappeared. But he also wrote that he missed me and that he hoped I was safe. The letter was a lifeline and a reminder of the complexities that still tied me to the family I had left behind. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the drawer of my nightstand, unsure if I was ready to respond or what that response might look like. For days, the letter stayed there, a quiet presence in the background of my new life. Then came the visit from Lisa, my daughter-in-law, a woman who had once seemed poised and confident, but now looked smaller, less sure as she entered the cafe where I worked. Heather spotted her first, her eyes narrowing with suspicion as Lisa lingered near the pastry display, pretending to read the menu while her gaze searched the room for me. I did not approach her. Instead, I continued wiping counters and refilling sugar caddies, letting her wait for a moment longer in the uncomfortable silence. When she finally came over and asked if we could talk, her voice was low and uncertain, a fragile truce between apology and accusation. We sat in a corner booth, the hum of the cafe around us, the smells of coffee and cinnamon rolls grounding me in the present as she spoke of panic, regret, and fractured families. She claimed that the chaos of that night, the party where I had been locked away, was not her intention, but a mistake born of fear and exhaustion. She said they thought I was behind them, that they had no idea I would be left alone for hours. Her words were hurried, like someone trying to rewrite a story that had already been told too many times, too loudly. I listened, but said little, my silence a shield and a statement. The conversation shifted to Kieran, to his struggles and his longing to reconnect, and she pressed an envelope into my hands, a small gesture that felt more like a peace offering than a real attempt at reconciliation. I took the envelope without enthusiasm, knowing that the contents, whatever they were, would not change the fact that I was no longer the woman they thought they could control or dismiss. Soon after, Adam, my son, hired a lawyer to intervene, a man who appeared at the cafe unannounced, his suit crisp and his demeanor cautious. He spoke carefully of concern and next steps, of safe environments and well-being assessments. But I heard the underlying message loud and clear. They wanted me to come back, to return to the role they had assigned me, to be a convenient presence, rather than a living, breathing person with her own needs and boundaries. I told him, firmly and without hesitation, that I was not a pet to be managed, that I was of sound mind and safe where I was, and that any further contact under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. He left blinking in the light of my resolve, and I felt a deep satisfaction in standing my ground, a reclaiming of power that no longer depended on their approval or acceptance. The family's attempts to control me extended beyond personal visits and legal maneuvers. A local newspaper ran an article on the front page of the community section, labeling me as the missing matriarch and quoting my son and daughter-in-law's concern for my vulnerability and safety. The article painted me as a fragile woman who had vanished without explanation, fueling whispers and speculations among neighbors and acquaintances. I kept the clipping not as a trophy, but as proof of how little they understood me and how willing they were to rewrite the truth to fit their narrative. The article became a symbol of their fear and my freedom, a public performance of care that masked their desire to keep me in a box. Despite the public spectacle, my days settled into a comforting routine. Arthur, a widower who frequented the cafe, became a quiet companion in my new life. His presence was steady but unassuming, a man who shared stories about birds and memories of a wife who had loved better coffee than mine. We didn't speak of the family drama or the articles. Instead, we found solace in small talk and the understanding that sometimes companionship is found not in grand declarations, but in shared silences and gentle nods. Heather, my supervisor at the cafe, showed her own kind of support through simple gestures, a saved crossword puzzle page, an extra shift without question. These acts of inclusion and kindness contrasted starkly with the cold distance of my family, reminding me that connection can be found in unexpected places and that belonging is not always tied to blood. The letters from Kieran continued, each one a fragile thread of hope and reconciliation. But I was careful not to rush into answers or promises. Healing was a process that required time and space, and I was learning to honor my own pace, to choose when and how to open doors rather than having them slammed shut or flung wide open against my will. The tension between my new life and the past came to a head one rainy afternoon when Lisa appeared again at the cafe. This time, her demeanor was quieter, tinged with weariness rather than confrontation. She spoke softly of not trying to replace me, but wanting to build a family that didn't live in the shadow of old wounds. Her words, fragile as they were, offered a glimpse of honesty I hadn't expected. I told her firmly that I was no shadow, but a woman who had learned to stand on her own, and with that, our conversation ended. She left without finishing her coffee, and I returned to the rhythms of my life, the soft sounds of the city, and the quiet companionship of Joyce and Arthur. Yet even as I built this new existence, the past was never far behind. Letters, visits, and legal notices reminded me of the family that had once defined me and the fractures that now separated us. I faced these challenges not with bitterness, but with the steady knowledge that I was choosing a different path, one of autonomy and self-respect rather than obligation and sacrifice. Each letter I wrote, whether to my grandson or to the lawyer, was a careful balance of kindness and boundary setting, a way of saying I cared but would no longer be controlled. The legal letter I sent to Derek Sorensen, Adam and Lisa's representative, was clear and unyielding. I was of sound mind, safe, and not under duress. Any further contact would be harassment. I signed it with a steady hand and mailed it with the calm certainty of someone who had reclaimed her voice. Life in Portland was not without its struggles, but it was mine. The community potluck Joyce invited me to was a small but significant step into belonging, a gathering of faces unfamiliar yet welcoming, where I carried a cake baked with care and offered slices wrapped in cinnamon and memory. The laughter and chatter of that evening filled a space inside me that had long been empty, a reminder that connection is built slowly, often without fanfare, and that new families can be chosen and nurtured in unexpected places. The letters from Kieran grew more frequent, each one a reminder of the love that still existed beyond the fractures. When he came to visit, Our reunion was quiet and tentative, marked not by tears or grand gestures, but by shared stories and the simple warmth of presence. I told him I was proud of the man he was becoming and that he was always enough. Our embrace was long and silent, a moment of healing that spoke louder than words. The presence of new friendships and the gentle routines of daily life grounded me even as the past reached out with its complex mix of regret and demand. I knew they would try to pull me back, to fit me once more into the roles they had carved out for me, but I was no longer willing to be shaped by their expectations. I had built a life not defined by their control, but by my own choices. The quiet strength I had found in Portland was not the absence of pain, but the presence of resilience. It was the knowledge that even when the past threatened to overshadow the present, I could stand firm, hold my ground, and continue to walk forward on my own terms. And so I did, day by day, letter by letter, moment by moment, until the weight of the past grew lighter and the promise of a new future stretched wide before me. The moment I sat down to write that letter to Derek Sorensen, the lawyer representing Adam and Lisa, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a calm born not of resignation, but of finality and quiet strength. The letter was brief, precise, and carried the weight of years of unspoken truths and unacknowledged pain. I told them in no uncertain terms that there was no cause for further legal contact, that I was of sound mind and safe in a place I had chosen for myself, and that any attempts to reach me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I signed it with a steady hand and mailed it the next morning, a simple but irrevocable act that marked the boundary between my past and the life I was determined to live on my own terms. This letter was more than just words on paper. It was a declaration of autonomy and self-respect, a final cutting of the ties that had bound me to roles I no longer wished to play. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with a locked bathroom door and ended with the quiet reclaiming of my voice and space. But the climax of this chapter was not confined to that letter alone. It came also in the form of a short note I wrote to Lisa, a few measured lines that conveyed everything and nothing at once. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I mailed it with a stamp bearing a finch, a small bird that sings even in the cold, a symbol of resilience and hope. I did not expect a response, nor did I want one. The act of writing and sending that note was enough. It was a moment of closure that required no audience or applause. Then, unexpectedly, Lisa appeared at the cafe where I worked. She was a shadow of the polished woman who had once orchestrated family gatherings with an iron smile. Her coat was tailored, but her eyes carried a weariness that softened the sharp edges of our last encounter. Heather saw her first and watched with quiet suspicion as Lisa hovered near the pastry display, pretending to read the menu but clearly searching for me. I did not approach her. I continued my work with deliberate calm, letting her wait until she could no longer avoid the inevitable. When she finally asked if we could talk privately, I nodded and led her to a booth in the back, the hum of the cafe and the scent of coffee wrapping around us like a protective cloak. She spoke of panic and regret, of a family unraveling in my absence, but also of a fragile honesty, that she had never meant to erase me, but had feared my presence as a shadow that darkened every room. Her words were soft, tinged with vulnerability, a rare glimpse behind the mask she wore so well. I listened without interruption, my own heart steady despite the swirling emotions beneath. I told her firmly that I was no shadow, that I was a woman who had learned to stand on her own and who would no longer be a ghost in their lives. She left without finishing her coffee, and I returned to the rhythms of my new existence, feeling a quiet sense of peace that had nothing to do with reconciliation, but everything to do with self-possession. That evening, Joyce and I sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, the air thick with the scent of rain and wood smoke. We watched the clouds roll over the neighborhood, each of us lost in our own thoughts, but connected by the shared silence. Joyce asked if I thought they would come for me, if the family would try to pull me back into their carefully constructed world. I did not answer immediately, choosing instead to breathe in the cool night air and feel the steady beat of my own heart. Finally, I said, "I know they will, but I am ready." The days that followed were a testament to the power of boundaries and the courage to maintain them. I continued to work at the cafe, to build friendships with Heather and Arthur, to find joy in the small moments that made life worth living. When the mail arrived with another letter from Kieran, my grandson, I opened it with a tenderness reserved for those who still hold a place in my heart without expectation. He wrote simply, asking if I would come to visit, if we might sit together and talk without the shadows of the past looming over us. I did not answer right away, but the letter sat on my desk like a promise waiting to be kept. The final cut came not in confrontation or dramatic gesture, but in the quiet act of standing firm, of choosing myself over the roles others had assigned me. It was the knowledge that I could say no without guilt, that I could walk away without regret, and that I could live fully and freely on my own terms. In that moment, I was neither victim nor survivor. I was a woman who had reclaimed her story, her dignity, and her life. And that was enough. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of my small room, casting gentle shadows that seemed to dance with the quiet rhythm of my heartbeat. I sat by the window, holding the letter from Kieran in my hands, its edges worn from being unfolded and refolded more times than I could count. His words, simple yet full of meaning, echoed softly in my mind. "I'm coming to Portland. I want to see you. Just me." There was no pressure, no demand, just the tentative reach of a boy growing into a man, seeking connection on his own terms. I smiled, a smile that felt both fragile and fiercely real. After so many years of waiting and wondering, of doors closed and voices silenced, here was a bridge, not an obligation, but an invitation. The days leading up to his arrival were a mixture of anticipation and calm, a space I allowed myself to fill with hope rather than fear. I chose my clothes carefully, not to impress, but to honor the woman I had become. A navy coat that had become a symbol of my reclamation, a clean shirt, and a touch of lipstick that felt like a quiet rebellion against invisibility. I didn't tell Joyce where I was going. She never asked, understanding that some journeys are private, even when they lead to those we love. The Red Fern Motel was modest, its worn exterior a contrast to the brightness I felt inside. I knocked once, and the door opened with a familiarity that was both comforting and strange. Kieran stood there, taller than I remembered, a softness in his eyes that mirrored my own. We did not rush into embraces or apologies. Instead, we moved slowly, aware of the space between us that needed tending. The room smelled of takeout and hotel soap, simple and unpretentious, much like our reunion. He showed me the books he had brought, a silent testament to the boy who found refuge in stories and the man who sought understanding through them. We spoke of small things, the weather, the city, the gentle rhythms of daily life, and of big things, the past and its wounds, the future and its possibilities. His voice cracked with emotion, not from sadness, but from the weight of truth finally shared. "You were always enough," I told him. And in that moment, I knew it was true for both of us. We didn't cry. We simply breathed deeper. The silence between us filled with a new kind of peace. When it was time to part, there were no promises made or questions left unanswered. We knew that healing is not a destination, but a journey taken one step at a time. Our hug was long and quiet, a hold that spoke of forgiveness, understanding, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Back at the cafe, life resumed its steady pace. Heather handed me a new apron, deep green with stitched lettering that read, "Not your grandma's kitchen." I laughed fully and without reservation, the sound carrying the joy of renewal. Arthur raised his mug in a silent salute, his eyes twinkling with approval. At home, Franklin greeted me with his usual grumble and headbutt, demanding attention on his own terms. Joyce was busy in the kitchen, her presence a comforting constant in the ebb and flow of my days. Together, we shared simple meals and quiet conversations, the kind that don't need words to fill the space between two people who understand each other. One evening, as the rain tapped gently against the window, I sat on the porch with a pen and a blank card. I wrote to myself, words flowing from a place of deep knowing. "Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened. Well done." I taped the card inside my dresser drawer, among the old recipe cards and memories, a reminder for the days when doubt might creep in. The past, with all its shadows and scars, no longer held sway over me. I was no longer waiting for life to start. I was living it fully, on my own terms, with grace and quiet strength. The neighborhood around me moved with the gentle pulse of everyday life. Neighbors tending gardens, children playing in the street, the distant hum of traffic softened by trees and time. I walked these streets with a steady heart, knowing that belonging is not always about where you come from, but where you choose to stand. The letters from Kieran continued, each one a thread woven into the fabric of our slowly mending relationship. When he left Portland, our goodbye was tender but unhurried, marked not by grand gestures, but by the simple warmth of shared understanding. He held on a little longer than necessary, the hesitation of a boy unsure if he was still allowed to hold on to this connection. I whispered, "Be good to yourself." And he replied, "You too." Words that carried the weight of love and hope without the need for more. Life settled into its new rhythm, a rhythm I shaped with my own hands and heart. The community potluck at the church basement was a testament to the unexpected places where belonging takes root. Surrounded by strangers who became friends, I carried a cake baked with love and memories, sharing slices wrapped in cinnamon and hope. Laughter and conversation filled the room, a symphony of lives intersecting and intertwining in ways I had long forgotten. Joyce teased me about looking smug, and I didn't deny it. For the first time in years, I felt truly part of something, not because I had to prove my worth, but because I simply was. The house, the cafe, the streets of Portland, they were not grand or glamorous, but they were mine. They were the backdrop to a life reclaimed and rebuilt, brick by brick, moment by moment. As I sat on the porch with a warm cup of tea, watching the moon rise over quiet streets, I understood that freedom is not loud or dramatic. It is the soft unfolding of a woman who has finally chosen herself, who has learned to hold her own light steady in the dark, and who knows that the best stories are those still being written. If this story finds you at the right moment, know that it is never too late to step out of the shadows and into the life you deserve. Be your own sign, your own noise in the silence, your own step away from the places that locked you away. And when you do, come back and tell me. I'll be here, listening, ready to welcome you home. When I think about how things unfolded after those events, I realize that real life began the moment I allowed myself not to return, but to keep walking toward a place where no one dictated their version of who I should be. In the first months, I lived almost on autopilot, working at the cafe, talking to Joyce, walking through the parks, feeling the rough warmth of tree bark under my hands as I sat on a bench and simply watched the wind stir the leaves. It was my quiet therapy, the invisible process of learning to trust myself again. But sometimes, in those clear, almost tranquil days, shadows appeared. Not so much from the past as from what still remained unsaid. One day I saw them, not my daughter and son-in-law, but someone from their circle. She sat in the same cafe where I worked, at a table by the window. We exchanged glances, and I noticed how her eyes widened slightly, as if she had seen a living person where she had expected only a ghost. I brought her coffee, and she couldn't resist saying, "We thought you were in a nursing home." There was no malice in her voice, only that awkward mix of curiosity and discomfort that arises when someone breaks the script written for them. I smiled and said softly, "No." I chose a different place. She went quiet, and in that pause I felt a small, almost childlike joy, not because I had put her in her place, but because I stood firmly in mine, calm and certain. Joyce, seeing that I often came home a little later than usual, sometimes teased, "You're becoming quite the social lady." I laughed, but in that laugh there was truth. I was allowing myself to be in the world, not hiding from it. One evening shift at the cafe, Arthur came in with a small bouquet of wildflowers. He said nothing, just placed them in an old mug on the counter and sat at his usual table. Those flowers stayed in my home for a week afterward, and every time I looked at them, I remembered that new connections don't always enter your life loudly. Sometimes they arrive quietly, and yet they remain. Sometime later, a letter arrived from Kieran, this time longer. He wrote about starting college, about a new friend, about how he had begun photographing old houses in their neighborhood. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "I remember when we painted that bird feeder together. I think that's when I understood that the smallest things can be the most important." These words, simple and unassuming, touched something deep inside me. I sat at my kitchen table holding the letter, and for the first time in a long while, I cried. Not from hurt or anger, but from knowing that a part of me still lived in his memory as something bright and needed. That same evening, I wrote him back. I took my time with the words, deciding not to hide the fact that life had not been easy. I told him I was happy for his successes, proud of him, that I remembered every detail of that day with the bird feeder, and that I hoped he would always keep that ability to value the small things. At the end, I added, "I haven't disappeared. I just chose where to be." His reply came a week later. He wrote that he wanted to visit me in the summer, to walk through the city, take photographs, and show me his work. Reading those lines, I understood that this was not just an invitation to meet, but to begin a new chapter in our relationship, one that was honest, without intermediaries or false smiles. Meanwhile, life at the cafe went on. There were new regulars, each with their own story, I learned to notice details. The elderly couple who always ordered the same thing, the young woman at the window table who wrote letters by hand, the man in the dark coat who always left a few coins at the edge of the table, as if leaving a small token of gratitude. These observations made me more attentive to myself. I began to see my own changes. Sometimes in the evenings, I walked not home, but to the park with the old maples, sitting there to listen to the wind. I found that I could think about the past without the heaviness it once carried. It stopped being a stone dragging me down and became part of my foundation, solid but no longer binding. And then one day, when I had almost stopped expecting anything from that old life, a postcard arrived. Not from Kieran, from my daughter. On the front was a city view from above, and inside only a few words. I don't know if I can fix anything, but I know I miss you. I held the postcard in my hands and felt a strange blend of warmth and caution. I knew I didn't want to go back, but I also understood something else. I no longer wanted to carry anger. That evening, I wrote a reply. It was short. I'm fine. I hope you are too. Peace is possible, but it starts with honesty. I didn't know if she would answer, and I didn't expect her to. It was no longer for her. It was for me, a way to finally stop carrying what made it hard to breathe. When summer came, Kieran arrived. We walked through the city, laughed at his attempts to capture the pigeons on camera, drank lemonade in a small cafe that smelled of fresh pastries, and sat on a bench watching the setting sun paint everything in soft gold. He showed me his photographs, and I saw in them the same love for detail I had in myself, the ability to find beauty in small things. That evening, as I walked him back, I realized that my new home was not only walls, but the people I allowed inside my life. That my past no longer decided who I was, and that the door I closed that night was not the door to a bathroom, but the door to a life where I was unheard, and I would never open it again.